Hello and welcome again to RP-0 America. So I made a sounding rocket to test out my F-1. I built this, kind of got it ready. I like how it looks and everything. Let me just check the staging. It's a very heavy sounding rocket. So I built this to basically get more reliability in the F-1 engine, and then realized that, center click, no, there is no test flight config for the F-1 engine. So I did a little research. I found that there's pretty much no failures in the F-1 engine. Like there might be like small, like during actual flight testing. There weren't really many F-1 engines flown overall, and by the time they were only ever on Saturn V's, and by the time they were actually launching Saturn V's, they didn't really have any reliability issues with them at all. So I'm fine with leaving it without a test flight config for my purposes, because by the time buying, unlocking the F-1 engine was expensive. So I'm fine just using it without it having any risk of failing. It still has a limited burn time and everything like that. Or actually, no, technically it doesn't, since it has no test flight config. That's bad, but I won't use it beyond its actual rated burn time anyway, so I'll have to quickly look that up to make sure it's not above that. But beyond that, I am still going to fly it as a sounding rocket because I said I would, and I kind of want to anyway. And it'll illustrate some interesting points. Oh, sorry, twitchy clicky. So I have attached I actually just went into my sub-assemblies and took my re-entry vehicle, Generation 2, and that's all that is. That's my only payload is this dinky little thing there. Actually, I might be able to just quickly check the mass by, no, fail. Alright, that's alright. I can still quickly check the mass, hopefully without messing up the staging. So it's just a 1-ton re-entry vehicle, and that doesn't appear to have destroyed the staging, which is nice. Throw this on, at staging. Right, I don't know if I wanted to do that, but I guess it kind of has to if I yeah, sure, why not? All right, so I'll leave it as is, and I will build that. So it's an expensive sounding rocket. It's a 500-ton sounding rocket, and yeah, it doesn't have enough delta V as a single stage to reach orbit. And I hope this mission will help illustrate why that is. So I'm telling it to build that. Did I make change? No, not really. I just pulled that off, put it back on anyway. But yeah, I've got the F-1 engine, which is awesome. To actually really do anything with it, I might build like pretty much the way my Saturn 1 was. My Saturn 1 first stage has 8 H-1 engines, and here I would, it has those 8 H-1 engines have pretty much the same thrust as an F-1. So I might just turn that use the first stage I'm using in this as kind of a regular first stage for later use, basically where the second stage is an S4B Saturn stage, which is just a same diameter tank but with a J2 engine. So 23 days to build. Those are all my timers. All right, so let's construct this rocket. Yeah, this is part of the reason I'd never try. Like I think, in my opinion, making a single stage to orbit in realism overhaul with like realistic engines and realistic everything else is a pipe dream. But I love watching people chase it. Like whenever people come into the realism overhaul IRC and discuss, hey, how do you build? I'm having these troubles building a single stage to orbit in realism overhaul because it's so easy in stock, just because the delta V requirement to orbit is so low. It's extremely challenging in reality to make a single stage to orbit. If you're curious of any like real sane attempts to potentially do that, there's like the Sabre engine, which acts somewhat like a jet engine. It actually breathes. It uses liquid oxygen like a jet engine would near the ground, and it brings oxidizers so that during the final part of reaching orbit, it brings its own liquid oxidizer to do that. And that is a super cool engine that is being in development for quite a long time by a British company, I believe. All right, so I'm going to use this giant piece. This is a sounding rocket, just because I said I would. All right, let's light it on fire. Engine is burning, and you can see it's burning 1.5 tons, or at least 1,500 liters of liquid oxygen per second. It is a huge engine. So you can see how much it massed at launch. And part of the reason why making a single stage to orbit is so difficult is because I'd have to bring the entire dry mass of this stage to orbit. And you know, the delta V is close, but that number, you know, getting the key 9,500 meters per second number, it's a dragon that just keeps moving away from you. You know, if I made this tank a little lighter, sure, you'd get more delta V, but you still have to drag this whole first stage's dry mass to orbit. Whereas if you make a two-stage or any kind of multi-stage vehicle, you can have this big, hefty first stage to throw you up, you know, out of the atmosphere up to a decent speed. But ultimately, you can ditch it. You don't have to put a ton of energy into accelerating the dry mass of that first stage itself, and leave it behind, like the second stage, which has, you know, has all of its capabilities still remaining once it gets rid of the first stage. So this is a very good first stage itself. It's pretty much the same as like I said, the Saturn 1 design that I have. It just with one engine instead of 8 engines, and I think it's actually a little cheaper. One of these engines is cheaper than 8 H1 engines, and it is very reliable. It was very expensive to unlock, but I think I'd really like to use this engine, you know, for a lot of things. So I'll have to look into maybe just giving it a skeleton test flight config, just to limit it to the realistic burn time. It should at the very least have that, even if it's an extremely reliable engine, because the F-1 engine underwent so much ground testing. I find the ground testing program of NASA and of this, you know, the Saturn Apollo program in general, just an astounding engineering feat, because they didn't just test F-1 engines on the ground. They tested the whole first stage of the Saturn V on the ground. The test facilities they use for it are just tremendous in scale. I highly recommend, you know, looking up. I'm pretty sure there's videos of that, and there are lots of pictures of it, high definition pictures, which I find very cool. So we're, you know, increasing in speed, but so another trade-off you make, in, you know, a benefit you get from having a multi-stage vehicle is that the efficiency of this first stage, it has to be able to actually produce a lot of useful thrust and have a decent efficiency at ground level. And so the nozzle is designed to fight back against the push of the atmosphere. But now that it's up here, you'd want the nozzle to be a lot more expanded, you know, to make better use of the fuel, of the gases as they escape the nozzle. You'd have to have a bigger, longer nozzle or something. And because we have this fixed nozzle that has to function effectively at ground level, we're kind of stuck in this situation where the efficiency isn't very impressive at all at altitude. But that's okay, because normally you wouldn't be trying to bring this engine into orbit at all. All right. So we are 50 seconds away from, so we still have 50 seconds of burn time left, and the G-forces are already exceeding what we would normally allow our crew to undergo. Of course, there's no people in this rocket, but it's worth keeping in mind how high the G-forces can get in a rocket like this, because a single stage to orbit rocket has to be capable of lifting itself off the ground when it's full of fuel and not killing not destroying the cargo or killing the passengers, whatever the case may be. Oh, I still want to be able to see the ground. All right, let's tilt so we can see the ground. That's good enough for me. Let's move this out of the way. So now it's up to 7.5 Gs. So an engine, to resolve that, an engine needs to be able to throttle, right? In this case, the F-1 engine was not made to throttle at all. It's made to be very reliable, but there's no reason for it to have been given throttling abilities. They maybe could have engineered that in if it was something kind of a growth target, something they wanted to get. But when they did make improved versions of the F-1, or at least designed them. They never ended up flying them, called the F-1A, and they designed it to just give more thrust and a little bit more efficiency, because that's what's more important on a first stage engine. And so this engine cannot throttle. So when used on a Saturn V, the F-1 engine, the Saturn V has 5 F-1 engines on the first stage, and as a result of that, let me go out to this view, it does reach a pretty high thrust-to-weight ratio shortly before burnout. There we go, and I shut it down just a dash early. So as you can see, it almost made it to orbit. If, let's say, actually I can calculate that. So let me select that. So if we, say, had a very light second stage that could deliver, just a moment, that could deliver only that amount of delta V, just 804 meters per second of delta V, we would have got to orbit, which isn't a lot of delta V considering how much the previous portion did. So when used as a first stage, this can actually throw, let's imagine this is pretty similar to the S1 first stage, which I keep saying, or the S1B, and it can throw, what was it, like 15 tons to orbit, something like that, like a 15-ton, and that was the like a partially fueled Apollo service module with an Apollo capsule. And let's drop that off now. So right before you saw that, it was that whole stage with the full first stage engine and the first stage tank and everything. That masses like 30 tons. So it's not, just doesn't quite have the lifting power to throw itself completely into orbit. And we can see that. And it's just not an efficient thing to do anyway. So using a purely fuel and oxidizer based engine stage like that just does not make sense to try to make it into a single staged orbit. But that isn't to say it's not worth designing, and I'd be really interested in seeing people who build two-stage to orbit, like space planes, rather than, say, like a shuttle where it has two solid boosters and this external fuel tank. It drops those on the way to orbit. The solid boosters were recovered. The external tank was not. So rather than that design where those three things are effectively dropped, and the large shuttle body itself, that whole shuttle body has to make it to orbit. Perhaps maybe there are a whole bunch of different competing designs for the space shuttle, and one that I find that looks particularly cool is like a double shuttle, where you have imagine a smaller version of the space shuttle with a smaller cargo bay, because really only like U.S. military, U.S. government, kind of secret contractors wanted the shuttle to have such a large payload bay. And so you could carry a crew for the same amount of time in a shuttle up to orbit with a much smaller shuttle, just with more of a limitation of the size of the cargo that it could bring to orbit. But anyway, a smaller shuttle on the back of a much larger shuttle-type craft, which could, say, launch from a runway. It could have jet engines as part of that first stage. So it takes off at maybe like a regular plane from the ground, using regular jet engines or hybrid engines, and then brings the smaller shuttle up to a higher altitude, to a fairly high altitude and a decent speed, and then would release it. That's a super cool design. I don't recall which contractor proposed that to NASA as their version of the shuttle that they wanted to build, but there were plenty of cool designs that were proposed. So close, let's take new photographs. Yes, let's get rid of those. Yeah, we're over the water, so we're unfortunately not going to get a new science really from this craft. I just wanted to launch it to, have an F-1 powered sounding rocket, because it's just such a big, cool waste of money. All right, so let's stop this motion and point ourselves in a good position for re-entry. So this re-entry body, this is something we tested many missions ago, maybe within the first 5, maybe 10 videos of the previous series in an older version of KSP. Let's just remove that. And it's a very light payload, right? But it, even just without having any second stage at all, that F-1 sounding rocket could not place this into orbit. So I hope that helps to explain to you why ultimately we build multi-stage craft, because you keep dumping the dry mass of the previous stage by doing that. That's a part of the reason to use a kick stage in, say, throwing something at Jupiter, because, let's say, a Centaur can throw a very substantial amount of mass. I'll have to reorient before we hit the atmosphere. It can throw a very substantial amount of mass, beyond low Earth orbit, but not quite up to Jupiter speed. But then you ditch the Centaur. Even the empty Centaur has a decent mass of multiple tons, and then all you have to bring is this smaller solid motor, which has a much lower dry mass, to give you that extra little kick that lets you go from most of the way towards the orbit of Jupiter, all the way out to the orbit of Jupiter. Yeah, it's really those ratios. It goes through the rocket equation, which I plug into many times. I've plugged into plugged the rocket equation and the starting mass of a stage, the dry mass of the stage, the mass of a payload, etc., into a spreadsheet, because it's a straightforward equation. Just it has a logarithm in it, but even if you don't have a deep understanding of what a logarithm is, or any, just look up the the natural logarithm function in a spreadsheet program like Excel, and it'll calculate it for you there. You don't have to have a deep mathematical understanding of like what a lot of the complex concepts like calculus or exponents or logarithms, how they're actually built up, and like their true underlying nature to exploit them in a spreadsheet. If an equation has them, you just have to be able to duplicate that in software. Even something as simple as Excel will do that for you. Okay, so we're in a fairly good orientation for reentry. So I suppose we've got, regardless of whether this craft survives, I believe it did survive my initial test. I'm still fine with this mission. Oh darn, I should have taken pictures when I was over the land of Africa. Now why didn't I think of that? Oh well. So future upcoming missions. Good question. So we do have, let's see, where is the clock? Is that the right one? Yes. So we do have a number of craft on the way to Jupiter, and they will get there soon. I could design, let's see, I made myself a spreadsheet. I actually quickly skimmed back through all my previous RP-0 America videos to see what I've accomplished and what I haven't. So I have done a Mars flyby. According to my record here, I could be wrong, I need to do a quick review again, but I haven't put anything into Mars orbit. We don't have a Mars window on here yet, but that's worth considering. Mercury, we've done a flyby of Mercury. I could potentially put something into orbit of Mercury. I'll check if there's a contract available for that, but we do have that Mercury window coming up. So if there is a contract to put something into orbit of Mercury or crash something into the surface of Mercury, I might very well build that. Oh, sorry, we do have a Mars window. It's just very far in the future, and I have plans for that. We could throw much heavier things at Mars and do much more interesting things by the time that window comes around, I do hope. Venus, let's see, I have put something in orbit of Venus. I've done a flyby. I haven't crashed anything or done a Venus crasher or lander, so I'll also have to look to see if I can find a contract for that, to see if it's worth exploiting the Mars or Venus window. But yeah, there's some cool things I could do with Mars. So at this point, we're technology-wise, we're near the beginning of like the Apollo program, only we're not using Apollo. We intend to use Gemini hardware to land people on the moon. But at that point, it's not inconceivable, it's not unreasonable for NASA, depending on what their goals were, or what my space program's goals are, to start doing experiments on the surface of Mars. Because ultimately, I haven't made any secret about it, I would like to fly people on a flyby of Mars, possibly to orbit of Mars, maybe even land on Mars, but I feel like there are some major accomplishments regarding Mars that can come before me trying to land people on Mars and return them. Oh geez, I wonder if this has an off-center of mass. Even if your craft is somewhat unstable, if it's not perfectly stable, oh geez, if it's not stable in this position, whoa, you can think of it from the concept of buoyancy. Like even if you have something that's symmetric along the line, if you have, it could be that this point wants to be flipped backwards. But even if it isn't stable that way, which this one may not be, as long as you stay near this line of symmetry, you should be able to hold it near that line of symmetry. Even if it's not self-stabilizing, self-stabilizing is the concept or term I would use. Even if it is not self-stabilizing. Yeah, I'm glad there's no people in this because it's approaching 20 Gs, exceeding 20 Gs. So something self-stabilizing, if it moved away from this orientation, it would just naturally swing back that way. Imagine like a pendulum. A pendulum is self-stable where the mass of your pendulum is at its lowest point. So it would return towards that position. So imagine a pendulum now on it with a stick. You have a mass on a stick instead, and you try to balance it at the top position. That's an unstable, potentially stationary position, and that might be what I'm actually doing here, where I have to use the RCS in order to keep it in this orientation. So it's symmetric. That's one of the useful concepts of making something return safely. But if it's not stable in such a way that it will return itself to our ideal position, RCS might still be able to hold it there, right? Like if you've got, with that pendulum that you're trying to keep at the top point, as long as you've still got fingers around to poke it back towards the very top position, kind of try to balance it back there, it can stay there. So the RCS kind of helps it cheat what it naturally wants to do, which is flip around and commit suicide. This is such a simple crafter that it didn't matter to me to make it nice and elegant and stable, self-sustaining. All right, so we'll be bringing this down, and so our next videos may be construction of something for Mercury. We will see, or alternatively, it may be these craft actually doing their mid-course corrections and towards Jupiter. It's a long way out to Jupiter, so it's probably still at least a year maybe until they get to Jupiter, like past this window. But this mid-course correction may be worth a video. We will see. And then also, I'm unlocking technology ultimately that will let me build a Saturn V, which is awesome. Getting a J2 engine, which is the next real technology that will let me do cool things. It's a large, very powerful liquid hydrogen burning upper stage, so that will let me do tests of my hardware, which I intend to use to place people on the surface of the moon. I need a full. I think I dumped the heat shield, so now it's not attached but pushing. Yeah, see, so I can click on it, but it's not. The heat shield is not showing in there. And is the parachute? Ooh, it is not stable, but the parachute is not. There we go. Yep, the heat shield is no longer attached. So I will need an actual Saturn V, which will require both F-1 engines as well as J2 engines to be able to carry out its full mission. But that's what I will need to actually place people on the surface of the moon. But to test the hardware itself that I intend to, I can do without a full Saturn V. I'll probably build something like a Saturn 1B or Saturn 1C, which you'll see what that is when I build it, what I mean by that, because that is capable of placing a pretty substantial amount of mass in orbit of the Earth, but without enough fuel or oomph left over to throw it at the moon as well. But still, that's a cost-effective and sane way to kind of test out my craft and show all of its properties and details before we actually commit to sending people to the orbit of the moon and then onwards to the surface of the moon, which are our upcoming major goals. And I can also start planning on doing cool things with Mars. Alright, so we have successfully returned the payload from our F-1 engine first stage sounding rocket. So it's a really good first stage. Particularly, it has so much lift. Like I said, I'd compare it to a Saturn 1, and it just uses one engine on the first stage. It shows us that the F-1 is a powerful and very useful engine. We could build all kinds of intermediate rockets, but currently we lack an upper stage to really make good use of that. With the RL-10s we currently have are just so expensive that it is not worth building a second stage out of like 30 RL-10s rather than waiting until we have the J2, where we can use a much more modest number of J2 engines as a second stage. So advanced flight control I'm waiting for, and Hydrolux engine is that one I was talking about. So it'll be roughly a year. Yeah, until we have that. I'll have to look. I may as well check here. I've still got a little time. So advanced flight control is what I have unlocking next. I'm sure there's some important technology in there. Advanced flight control. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other stuff I'm going to want as well. Docking mechanisms are nice. More powerful quads, an actual instrument unit which will allow me to control heavier, large rockets. These APS, these are really useful for ullaging heavy upper stages, as well as orienting them. They're very useful. They're on the Saturn S4B stage. Yeah, there's all kinds of really good technology in here. And some unplaced hardware down here, labeled as non-RP-0. Yeah, there's definitely some key technology in here that I would really like. In particular, this. I don't really want to build a Saturn V without the appropriate hardware, which includes these two. Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. I'm happy with the ordering because I really wouldn't want to do much until I have both the technology I'm researching now, the advanced flight control, as well as hydrolox engines. And then, yeah, there's some other things which will be useful as well. I might need to bump here. Let me just bump it now. Landing might be required to actually use the legs that I need on my Gemini Direct lander, but we will see about that. So thanks for watching another episode of RP-0 America, where we made a sounding rocket with an F-1. Hope to make another video soon. Goodbye.